The air in the small restaurant was thick with the scent of fried food and the clinking of plates, yet to one man, it felt like a world away from his. A world of luxury. A world where people dressed in suits and ate at the finest restaurants, not these run-down establishments. James Thornton, the wealthy businessman, strode into the restaurant with a sneer. His eyes scanned the dusty walls and flicked over the peeling paint, as if every corner of the place was a personal insult to him. The clink of the door's bell seemed to announce his arrival with a flourish. His shoes clicked sharply against the floor as he approached the counter where the owner stood, wiping his hands on a rag. The owner, a man named Daniel, looked up from his work, his face lined with the years of struggle that had followed him since the business started to falter. A simple man, with kind eyes that had seen the depths of hardship. He had no idea who James Thornton was, but the businessman was already sizing him up. "You must be the owner?" James sneered, barely glancing at Daniel's worn apron. "I've heard about this place. People talk. You're barely hanging on, aren't you? A broke man trying to hold on to a dream that's slipping through his fingers." Daniel straightened a little, meeting the businessman's gaze. He didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to hang between them. The businessman's words were sharp, intended to wound, but Daniel knew better than to react too quickly. He'd seen this kind of judgment before. The wealthy often thought they knew the story of the struggling, the poor, the ones who didn't fit into their perfect little world. James leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'll give you some advice, friend. You should sell this place before it drags you any further down. Or just close it up. No shame in admitting you couldn't hack it." The words struck harder than Daniel expected, but they didn't break him. He just smiled, a soft and quiet expression, not in defiance but in understanding. After all, this was the world James lived in, one where success was measured by money and appearances. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands steady as he reached for a menu to hand the businessman. "You never know, sir. Sometimes the richest men in the world are the ones who've lost everything and come back stronger." James scoffed, about to make another sharp remark, when the restaurant's bell rang again. A regular customer walked in, a tired old man who was always kind to Daniel. The interaction served as a reminder to James that this was not a place where wealth determined status. Daniel, with all his struggles, still had something far more valuable than money: respect. James opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Something about Daniel's quiet confidence struck him in a way he didn't expect. For a moment, the businessman's bravado wavered. Maybe he had underestimated this restaurant owner. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this man than he could see. But that thought was fleeting. After all, how could someone with so little possibly teach him anything? He turned on his heel, ready to leave. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something here he was missing. Little did James know, his mocking words would soon come back to haunt him, and the man he dismissed would soon reveal a truth that would shatter everything James thought he knew about success, wealth, and the very nature of strength. James Thornton had never known failure. From a young age, he had been taught that success was a matter of hard work, intelligence, and, most importantly, money. His father had been a self-made millionaire who'd built his empire from nothing, and James had inherited that mindset along with the family business. His childhood was one of privilege, private schools, vacations to the most exotic locations, and an endless supply of material wealth. James had been raised to believe that money wasn't just a tool, it was the ultimate measure of a man's worth. And as he grew older, he watched the world around him bend to his will, as if it had always been this way. He remembered his first taste of real power. At just 25, James had taken over his father's company after his sudden death. His father's friends and colleagues had doubted his ability to lead, but James quickly silenced them by making sharp business decisions that propelled the company forward. He had an innate understanding of numbers, markets, and people, skills that made him indispensable in the world of business. But along the way, something inside James changed. He became more ruthless. More focused on making money than on the people around him. He saw every transaction, every decision, as a game, one where the only rule was to win. People, businesses, and even friendships were just pieces on the board. And in this game, there was no room for those who couldn't keep up. James's wealth continued to grow. His luxurious penthouse, his collection of cars, his fine clothes, they all became symbols of his success. He was respected, admired, and envied. And he had grown to believe that his success was inevitable, that he was simply better than everyone else. The notion that someone like Daniel, a humble restaurant owner, could ever rise to his level was laughable. To James, the world was divided into those who made things happen and those who simply watched from the sidelines. And anyone who had to work with their hands, anyone who struggled to make ends meet, was beneath him. So when James walked into that restaurant, his mind was already made up. He had seen countless businesses like it, struggling, clinging to their last remnants of life. He had dismissed them all as failures. But Daniel had struck him in a way he didn't expect. The owner's quiet demeanor, his refusal to show any sign of weakness, there was something about it that made James uneasy. And it wasn't just the restaurant's atmosphere that got to him. There was something deeper, a feeling he couldn't quite put his finger on. For a brief moment, when Daniel had spoken about strength, James had felt a flicker of doubt. What if there was more to success than wealth? What if there was something the owner understood that he didn't? James pushed the thought aside. He had worked too hard for too long to let the actions of a restaurant owner shake his beliefs. Wealth, he knew, was everything. Everything else was secondary. Still, the nagging feeling lingered. What was it about Daniel that made him feel unsettled? What did he have that James didn't? The businessman shook his head, dismissing the thought. There was no time for such musings. He had a meeting in an hour, a new acquisition to oversee, and a life to continue living at the top of the pyramid. But as he drove away from the restaurant, the image of Daniel standing there, calm and collected, seemed to follow him. It was as if the old man's quiet confidence was calling to him from the shadows. And for the first time in years, James found himself questioning what it really meant to be successful. Daniel had always loved the idea of running his own restaurant. He remembered the early days, filled with excitement and ambition. His dream had been simple, to create a place where people could come, enjoy a good meal, and feel at home. The menu was modest, but it was full of heart, and the food was always made with care. He knew the names of his regulars, and they knew his. It was more than just business, it was a community, a connection between him and those who came to dine. But over the years, things had changed. Competition grew fierce, and the once bustling neighborhood had shifted. Where there used to be families and children running down the street, now there were empty storefronts and abandoned buildings. It was hard not to feel the weight of it all, especially when the bills kept piling up, and customers became fewer and farther between. At night, Daniel often found himself sitting in the dim light of his office, going over the books again, praying that somehow, against all odds, he could make it work. But the numbers didn't add up. He was behind on rent. His suppliers were starting to cut him off. And the bank had already warned him that they wouldn't extend his loan much longer. His dream, his entire life's work, was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do about it. He had tried everything. He cut costs where he could, worked longer hours, and even borrowed money from friends and family to keep the business afloat. But nothing seemed to be enough. And every day, he watched more and more people walk right past his restaurant without a second glance. Still, Daniel kept his head up. He didn't complain. He didn't show his frustrations. His regulars, those few who still came by, noticed it, though. They could tell that something was different. There was a quiet weariness in his eyes, a shadow of doubt that hadn't been there before. But he never let it show when they sat down at their usual spots. He greeted them with the same smile he always had, listened to their stories, and served their meals as if nothing had changed. But on the inside, it was a different story. The pressure, the anxiety, the fear of losing everything he had worked for, it was all there, gnawing at him, even when he tried to push it away. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had made a mistake. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this life. Maybe it was time to let go. Yet, even in the darkest moments, there was one thing that kept him going, the belief that he could turn it around. That he wasn't done yet. He wasn't ready to give up. He had spent so many years working toward this, building relationships, earning trust. It wasn't just a restaurant to him, it was his heart and soul. To give it up would feel like surrender. And surrender wasn't something Daniel knew how to do. One day, when the restaurant was particularly empty, Daniel sat at the bar, staring at the half-eaten plate of food in front of him. He had made it for himself, just as he had so many times before. It wasn't much, but it was his. Why is it always like this? He wondered aloud, though no one was around to hear. Why does it feel like I'm always fighting an uphill battle? The answer, of course, was that he didn't know. Life had a way of throwing obstacles in your path when you least expected it. Some days felt like the world was working against him. But deep down, Daniel believed in the power of perseverance. He had come this far, hadn't he? He wasn't about to let one more setback take everything away. But the reality was harsh. There were times when he felt completely alone, like a man drowning, grasping at straws in an ocean of uncertainty. No matter how much he fought, it seemed like the world was closing in around him. Then, one afternoon, James Thornton walked through his door. At first, Daniel had no idea who the man was. But it didn't take long for him to see the look of disdain in the businessman's eyes, the same look he had seen from many others over the years. James didn't even bother to hide it. To him, Daniel was just another failure. Just another struggling businessman who couldn't keep up. But Daniel wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. It had happened before, so many times before. The wealthy often looked down on those who struggled, assuming they were somehow superior, that their success made them better than everyone else. What James didn't know was that Daniel wasn't a failure. He had been knocked down, yes. But he had never stayed down. He wasn't ready to give up on his dream just yet. Daniel had seen people like James all his life. They wore their wealth like armor, hiding behind their money and their status. But in reality, they were fragile. And the more they looked down on others, the more they revealed how insecure they truly were. He didn't need to prove anything to James. He just needed to keep fighting. And fight he would. The days after James Thornton's visit seemed to blur together for Daniel, a constant cycle of trying to keep the restaurant open, watching the empty tables, and dealing with the mounting pressure that weighed on his shoulders. But despite the stress, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the memory of James, the arrogant businessman who had looked down on him without a second thought. Daniel tried to brush it off. After all, it was just another person who thought he didn't belong, who judged him without understanding his struggles. But something about James's words kept echoing in his mind. Broke, he had said, as if that one word could define him, could erase all the hard work, the years spent building this place from the ground up. As the days went on, Daniel noticed something strange. He'd never been one to seek confrontation, but he couldn't help but feel a quiet defiance stir inside him. Maybe it was the way James had dismissed him so easily. Maybe it was the way he had assumed that a man like Daniel couldn't have anything more than a failing restaurant. The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized that he had something James didn't: perseverance, heart, and an unshakable belief that no matter what, he wasn't going to let this place go down without a fight. The tension between the two men started to grow. James continued to walk past the restaurant whenever he was in the area, always glancing in with a hint of judgment. He had no idea what Daniel was going through, nor did he care. As far as James was concerned, Daniel was just another failed entrepreneur who had no place in his world. Daniel, on the other hand, began to notice James's pattern. The businessmen came by at least once a week, always around the same time. He'd stand on the sidewalk, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement as he looked over the restaurant, as if deciding whether or not it was worth his time. There was always a flicker of something, maybe pity, maybe disdain, in his eyes as he glanced inside, before walking away without ever stepping foot inside the door. The strange part? Daniel knew he could turn things around if he had just a little more time. If he could keep the doors open long enough for people to realize that this place was more than just a rundown restaurant, it was a sanctuary. But time was running out. Bills had to be paid, and the suppliers were breathing down his neck. Every day felt like a battle, and James's presence only seemed to remind him of how small and insignificant he sometimes felt. But Daniel wasn't ready to give up yet. He couldn't. This restaurant had been his dream, and no one, not even someone like James Thornton, could take that away from him. One afternoon, as the clock ticked closer to closing time, Daniel noticed James standing outside again. This time, the businessman seemed different. There was something in his posture, a hesitation that wasn't there before. He lingered longer than usual, as if caught between two decisions. Daniel watched him for a moment, his heart beating a little faster. Something was changing. Maybe it was the way James had been glancing in at the restaurant with curiosity, or maybe it was just the pressure of his own life weighing on him. But whatever it was, Daniel knew this wasn't the same businessman who had walked in months ago, ready to belittle him without a second thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James stepped toward the door. His hand hesitated at the handle before he pushed it open, stepping inside with the same air of superiority that Daniel had come to expect. But this time, there was something different, something that felt more like uncertainty than confidence. "Still running this place, huh?" James's voice was cold, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Daniel didn't answer immediately, instead watching the man carefully as he walked to a table near the back. "Business must be rough," James continued, taking a seat and glancing around, as though inspecting the place with the same dismissive look he had shown the first time. Daniel took a slow breath before replying. "Business is always rough," he said, his voice steady. "But you don't give up just because it gets tough, do you?" James raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "I'd say that's what separates the winners from the losers," he replied. The words hit harder than James intended. Daniel knew he had struck a nerve, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he set about preparing James's order, taking the time to do it with care, to show him that this restaurant was more than just a place to eat, it was a place where people mattered. As Daniel worked, his mind wandered. He had been through so much to get to this point. He wasn't just fighting for a meal, he was fighting for everything he had ever worked for. And though James couldn't see it, Daniel was proud of that. When he placed the food in front of James, their eyes met. James said nothing at first, staring down at the plate before finally meeting Daniel's gaze. "You really think this place can turn around?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as if unsure of his own words. Daniel smiled softly, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. "It can, if it's worth saving." For the first time since James had walked through the door, there was no mocking in his voice. There was only a question, an unspoken doubt that he hadn't expected to feel. James left the restaurant later that afternoon with a strange unease lingering in his chest. It wasn't the food, it was good, no doubt, and it certainly wasn't the same old story he was used to seeing in struggling restaurants. There was something different about Daniel's place, something James couldn't quite put his finger on. As much as he tried to brush it off, the thought of the quiet, resilient owner continued to nag at him. Over the next few days, James found himself inexplicably drawn back to the small restaurant. Every time he walked past, his gaze would shift instinctively toward the window. The longer he stood there, the more he found himself wondering how Daniel was managing to keep the place open when everything seemed to be stacked against him. He had heard all the rumors about the owner's financial troubles, about how he was behind on bills, and how no one thought the restaurant would last much longer. But when James stood outside and looked in, he didn't see a man beaten by life. He saw someone still fighting. Still holding on. And for some reason, it bothered him. It wasn't long before he found himself stepping inside again, much sooner than he expected. He tried to shake off the feeling that he was somehow compelled to be there, but deep down, he knew something was pulling him in. Daniel noticed him immediately as he entered. This time, the businessman didn't go straight to the back of the room like he had before. Instead, he stood by the counter, looking around as if trying to make sense of something he couldn't quite understand. Daniel set down his work and approached him slowly, his demeanor calm and composed, but there was a spark in his eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that he knew what was happening. He knew James was different now, though the businessman hadn't said a word. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," Daniel said, his voice even, as though this was just another day in the restaurant, though he could sense the tension in the air. James shifted uncomfortably before responding, "Just wanted to see how things were going." Daniel didn't offer him a seat, but instead, he simply stood there, waiting for him to elaborate. His quiet presence was enough to draw the truth out of James without forcing him. "You're still hanging on," James said after a long pause. "But I thought it was all over for you. I thought you'd have given up by now." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but instead, he gave James a long look. "It's never over," he said simply. "It's just one step after another. Some days, those steps feel harder than others. But that's what life is. The important thing is, I'm still standing. You can't beat someone who refuses to stay down." James swallowed hard, a little taken aback by the strength in Daniel's words. He had expected the usual response, perhaps an apology for the state of the restaurant or some form of resignation. But Daniel's words were anything but defeated. There was a conviction in them that stirred something in James. "What's your secret?" James asked, almost without thinking. Daniel smiled softly. "There's no secret," he said. "It's just grit. And the belief that one day, things will change if I keep working for it." James chuckled dryly, a small, almost bitter laugh. "You make it sound so simple. But it's not. Life's not simple. If you were smart, you'd sell. You'd walk away with what you have left and start something else, something more profitable." But Daniel shook his head. "I'm not just in this for the money. This is my life's work. You can't just walk away from something that matters." James paused at this, something shifting in his mind. He had spent his whole life chasing after wealth, after the next big deal, the next acquisition. He had believed that money could fix everything, that wealth could buy happiness, security, and status. But here was Daniel, a man with little to show in terms of money, yet he carried something far more valuable than James had ever considered, a sense of purpose. For a long moment, the two men stood there in silence. James looked at Daniel, his gaze softening as he realized that the owner wasn't just clinging to the past. He was still fighting for something greater than what money could offer. Before James could say anything else, the door swung open, and a group of regulars walked in, laughing and greeting Daniel like an old friend. James watched the exchange, the easy camaraderie between Daniel and his customers, the way they spoke to him with respect and affection. It wasn't something he was used to seeing. Daniel, with a quiet smile, turned to take their orders, his demeanor relaxed, as though he were exactly where he needed to be. James remained by the counter, lost in thought. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about his business dealings, his stock portfolios, or the latest luxury purchase. He was thinking about something else entirely. Could he ever find something like this in his own life? Was there something deeper, something more meaningful, than all the money he had earned? As he left the restaurant that day, James felt a strange sense of longing, a question he couldn't quite answer but couldn't shake either. What did it really mean to be successful? For the first time in years, he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong thing all along. Over the next few weeks, James continued to visit Daniel's restaurant, though not as frequently. Every time he entered, the familiar sense of unease lingered, but something else started to grow inside him, a curiosity. Daniel's quiet strength, his resilience in the face of relentless adversity, was something James couldn't ignore. It wasn't something he could easily dismiss anymore. The businessman found himself wondering what made Daniel tick, what kept him going despite everything. Then, one evening, after another routine visit, James decided to ask a question he had been wrestling with for days. He waited until the restaurant had settled into a quiet lull, the hum of conversation softening as people ate, and Daniel moved between the tables with his usual grace. The place was half empty, but it still had a warm, welcoming feeling, as though the struggles outside the walls hadn't reached this corner of the world. "Daniel," James began, his voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About what keeps you going." He paused, unsure of how to phrase the next part. "I've known a lot of people like you in my life. You know, people who work hard, who struggle, but they always have some big dream, something more they're fighting for. But I'm starting to wonder, what's your real story? There's more to you, isn't there?" Daniel glanced over at James, his brow furrowing slightly. It wasn't often that someone asked him questions like that, not in this way, at least. Most people either pitied him or dismissed him. But James wasn't doing either. There was genuine curiosity in his voice, and a small part of Daniel felt he could finally share something he had kept hidden for years. Daniel set down the plate he was carrying and took a seat across from James. He had never been one to talk much about his past, but for some reason, he felt compelled to now. Maybe it was because James had been different. Maybe it was because James had begun to see him as something more than just a failed businessman. "You're right," Daniel began slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "There is more to my story than meets the eye. Most people don't know this, but I wasn't always this." He gestured to the restaurant, the peeling walls, the empty chairs. "I didn't always struggle." James leaned in slightly, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Daniel exhaled deeply, staring at his hands for a moment before meeting James's gaze. "I was once part of the corporate world. Not at the top, but I worked for a company that was doing well. I had everything, a steady paycheck, a promising career. I was on the fast track to success, and I thought that's all that mattered." He paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "But then, something happened. I was caught up in a scandal, a mess of lies and deceit. A business partner turned on me, and everything I had built came crashing down. My reputation, my savings, everything." James's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He had never expected such a story. A scandal? But, why didn't you fight back? You could have. Daniel smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I did fight back. But when it all fell apart, it was too late. The damage was done. I lost everything. The house, the car, the company, and, most of all, my trust in people. But what I didn't lose was this." He gestured around the restaurant again, his expression more intense now. "I came here, started fresh. I opened this restaurant because it was the only thing I knew how to do, the only thing I still had faith in. Cooking, serving food, that was where I found peace after everything fell apart." James was speechless for a moment. He had been expecting to hear that Daniel had made a bad investment or taken a risk that didn't pay off. But this was different. Daniel had lost everything not because of his own choices, but because of someone else's betrayal. "I didn't know," James finally said, his voice almost a whisper. I had no idea. I thought you were just a struggling restaurant owner. Daniel nodded. Most people do. But it's more than that. I lost everything once, but I refused to let it define me. I started over, not for the money, but because I believed in this place. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I gave it everything I had, I could rebuild. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about proving to myself that I could keep going, no matter what. James sat back, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he realized how much he had taken for granted. He had always believed that success was about power, money, and control. But here was Daniel, who had lost everything and started again with nothing more than determination and hope. It was a revelation that cut deep. I never would have guessed, James muttered, almost to himself. Daniel's eyes softened. Most people wouldn't. But that's the thing. People look at you, they see what you have, and they think that's all there is to you. They don't know what's going on behind the scenes. What really drives you? James's chest tightened as he considered Daniel's words. He had spent so much time focusing on his own success, on his wealth and status, that he had never stopped to think about what really mattered. What made a person strong? What made them truly successful? Maybe I've been looking at things all wrong, James said quietly, the weight of his words settling between them. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging that James was beginning to see things differently. There was no need to say more. James had asked the right question, and now, he had to figure out the answer for himself. But as James left the restaurant that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in him had shifted, something deep and fundamental. Daniel's story had shown him a side of life he had never considered, a world where strength wasn't measured by wealth, but by the courage to keep going, no matter how many times you were knocked down. And for the first time in years, James Thornton wasn't sure what his next move would be, but he knew it would be different from anything he had done before. The following weeks saw a noticeable change in James Thornton. His meetings, once filled with high-stakes negotiations and quick deals, now seemed to hold less meaning. The constant buzz of phones, the relentless pursuit of more, began to feel hollow. Daniel's story had echoed in his mind at odd times, during meetings, while he walked past the restaurant, even as he sat in his luxurious office overlooking the city. Something was shifting inside him. James had always prided himself on his ability to control everything around him. Wealth, status, and power had always been his tools for dominance. Yet, when he stood in Daniel's restaurant, surrounded by its quiet resilience, he realized how fragile his world really was. He had been chasing something intangible, something that wouldn't last forever. On a chilly afternoon, unable to shake his restless thoughts, James found himself back at the door of Daniel's restaurant. This time, he wasn't just dropping by out of curiosity or to make a passing comment. No, today was different. Today, James had a question, one that had been festering inside him since their last conversation. As he entered, Daniel looked up from the counter, his eyes meeting James's. There was a calmness in Daniel's expression that James had come to recognize, a stillness that reflected strength, strength he hadn't yet found in himself. Back again, huh? Daniel said with a soft smile, his voice warm despite the tension that hung in the air. James walked toward him slowly, his eyes scanning the restaurant, taking in the humble surroundings that were beginning to feel more significant than ever. I've been thinking, he said, the weight of his words hanging between them. Daniel gestured to a seat. Take a seat. Can I get you something to eat? James shook his head. I'm not here for the food today. Daniel raised an eyebrow, sensing something was different about this visit. Then what brings you by? James let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About everything. He paused, his gaze meeting Daniel's. About you. About me. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the weight of James's words. "Go on," he said quietly. James hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward. "I've spent my entire life focused on what I could gain. Power, wealth, status. It's all I've ever known. But after hearing your story, I realized something. I've been measuring success by the wrong standard." Daniel stayed silent, allowing James to speak his mind. "I thought that if I had money, if I had the power to control people, that I was winning. But what's the point if I've built a life where I don't even know who I really am anymore?" James's voice softened, vulnerability seeping into his words. "I've spent so much time looking down on people like you, people who don't have anything, people who struggle. I didn't see that you've got something I've never had." Daniel remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "And what's that?" he asked gently. "Purpose," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got purpose. You've got a reason to wake up every day and fight. Even when you had nothing, you kept going because this place, these people, mean something to you." James leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table. "I've been blind to that my entire life. I've surrounded myself with wealth, with people who flatter me, who tell me what I want to hear. But I've never had what you've got, Daniel. I've never had something that made me feel like I was truly alive." The silence between them stretched for a moment before Daniel spoke. "It's not about what you have, James. It's about what you choose to do with it. You can have all the money in the world, but if it doesn't bring you peace, if it doesn't help you grow and become something better, what's the point?" James stared at Daniel for a long moment, the realization settling in like a weight. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," he confessed, gesturing to the life he had built, the buildings, the cars, the wealth. "I don't know what it means anymore." Daniel nodded slowly, as though he understood. "I can't tell you what to do with your life, James. But maybe it's time to stop chasing something you think you need and start chasing something that actually makes you happy. Success doesn't have to be about conquering others. It's about conquering yourself, finding peace in what you do, and finding a way to contribute to the world around you." James swallowed hard, the weight of Daniel's words sinking deep into him. For so long, he had been obsessed with winning, with showing the world he was the best. But now, as he sat here, listening to someone who had truly lost everything and rebuilt with nothing but grit and heart, James felt a profound shift within himself. "I've been wrong," James said, his voice hoarse. "I've been chasing the wrong things." Daniel didn't respond right away, but instead gave James a small, knowing smile. "It's never too late to start again." James stood up slowly, his thoughts whirling. I think I need some time to figure things out." "You're welcome here anytime," Daniel replied with a quiet warmth. "But don't just figure it out, live it." As James walked out of the restaurant, the air felt different. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about power. It was about living with purpose, with meaning, and with a desire to do something good, not for accolades, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was truly alive. He wasn't sure where the journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to chase success anymore. He was going to find something worth fighting for. James walked away from Daniel's restaurant that day with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The questions that had haunted him for so long still swirled in his mind, but now they felt different. They weren't questions about success or money, they were questions about meaning, about purpose, and about the kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. Over the next few weeks, James found himself revisiting his life in ways he hadn't considered before. His work, once filled with cutthroat deals and negotiations, now felt empty. The drive to accumulate more, to outdo his competitors, was replaced with a nagging sense that he had been living for the wrong reasons. And, as the realization grew stronger, so did the sense that something needed to change. He took time off from his business, an unusual move for someone who had built his identity around the idea of constant productivity. He spent the days walking through the city, visiting old haunts, meeting with people he hadn't seen in years. But all along, he kept thinking about Daniel, about the quiet strength he had found in that small restaurant, and about the wisdom that had been shared with him in that conversation. One evening, after a long day of reflection, James found himself standing outside Daniel's restaurant once again. The windows were dimly lit, the familiar glow spilling out into the street. It felt almost like a beacon, calling him back. He walked inside, more uncertain than ever, but also with a sense of purpose he hadn't had before. This time, he didn't feel the need to impress or justify himself. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to simply be. Daniel looked up when he entered, his face lighting up with the same quiet recognition. There was no judgment in his eyes, no unspoken question of why James was back. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging that James had come to terms with something important. "Good to see you again," Daniel said, his tone warm but unassuming. James sat at the bar this time, not expecting any grand answers. He didn't need them. He had come to realize that answers weren't what he had been looking for all along. It wasn't about finding a magic solution, it was about finding a way to live with intention, to take each step forward with the right heart. "I've been thinking," James began, his voice quieter than usual. "About everything you said. About purpose. About what it really means to live well." Daniel didn't rush him. He let the words come at their own pace, just as he had before. James continued, I think I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong things. I've been so focused on winning, on building this image of myself that I thought would make me happy, but it never did. Not in the way I thought it would." He paused, the weight of his realization settling in. "You were right. It's not about what you have. It's about what you do with it. What you do with your time, your energy, your life." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "It's easy to get caught up in the race, especially when the world tells you that more is always better. But I think we both know that there's more to life than just adding things up. The real value comes from what we leave behind. How we've lived. How we've made others feel." James sat back, taking in the words. The man before him, with all the trials and setbacks, had found a truth that James had never fully understood. It wasn't about the next big deal. It wasn't about the houses or the cars or the stocks, it was about the people you touched and the work you did with integrity. It was about finding peace in doing something meaningful, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. "I've been wrong all these years," James said, almost to himself. "But I'm starting to see it differently. I don't know what's next for me, Daniel, but I know it has to be something more than just more." Daniel smiled softly. "The first step is realizing that. Most people never do." And with that, there was a quiet understanding between the two men. James wasn't expecting a sudden transformation overnight. He knew it wouldn't be that simple. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally on the path to discovering what truly mattered. The following months were a time of deep reflection and subtle change for James. He began to distance himself from the world he had known for so long, stepping back from his high-powered business dealings to find a way to rebuild his life. He didn't know what it would look like, but for the first time, he felt at peace with the uncertainty. The world of luxury, power, and competition no longer held the same appeal. He realized it wasn't about being the best, it was about being the kind of person who could face life with honesty, humility, and grace. He stayed in touch with Daniel, occasionally stopping by the restaurant just to talk, not because he needed anything, but because he had come to value the wisdom and simplicity that Daniel had to offer. And as their friendship grew, James began to find his own place in the world, one that wasn't defined by wealth but by purpose. James learned that success wasn't about what you accumulated or how much you could show off to the world, it was about how you lived your life, how you treated others, and what kind of impact you had on the people around you. He discovered that sometimes, losing everything you thought mattered was the key to finding what truly did. It was about building something meaningful, not for recognition, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that what you were doing made the world a little bit better. James never forgot Daniel's words, the lesson that had shaken him to his core. And when he found his way back to his own sense of purpose, he knew that the true measure of success was found not in the things you owned, but in the life you lived. In the end, Daniel's restaurant had taught James something he could never have learned in the boardrooms or from his wealth. It had taught him the real value of perseverance, humility, and living with purpose. And for that, James was forever grateful.